Have you ever experienced a moment so surreal that you feel like you're trapped in someone's poorly written drama? That's exactly how I felt sitting in that cold courtroom, watching James's face twist into that smug, condescending smile I'd grown to recognize all too well during our 15 years of marriage. I'd prepared myself for the usual barbs, how I never contributed enough, how his career had always come first, how I'd enjoyed the lifestyle he provided without appreciation. But what came out of his mouth that day was a masterpiece of cruelty that silenced the entire room. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Eleanor was never more than a beautiful accessory, he said, his voice carrying easily through the hushed courtroom. A trophy wife who served her purpose until she didn't. Now she wants half of what I built? Let's be honest, she can barely balance a checkbook without my help. The attorney sitting beside me stiffened. Several people in the gallery shifted, uncomfortably in their seats. The judge's expression remained impassive, but I noticed a slight tightening around her eyes. I could feel the heat rising from my neck to my face, my hands trembling slightly under the table where I'd clasped them, so tightly my knuckles had turned white. But I didn't flinch. I didn't lower my gaze. I wouldn't give James the satisfaction of seeing me break, not after everything else he'd taken from me. Trophy wife. The phrase echoed in my head, bouncing against the walls of my skull like a ricocheting bullet. 15 years reduced to 2 dismissive words. 15 years of supporting his ambitions, managing our home, raising our daughter, hosting countless business dinners, and silently enduring his increasingly controlling behavior. All of it distilled into trophy wife. What made it worse wasn't just the words themselves. It was the knowing glances exchanged among his colleagues seated in the gallery. It was the barely concealed smirk on his attorney's face. It was the realization that this was how he'd been portraying me for years in private conversations I wasn't privy to. I scanned the courtroom, taking in the expensive suits, the polished shoes, the air of privilege that seemed to envelope everyone, connected to James. To them, this was entertaining, a brief, juicy interlude in their otherwise predictable day. Something to discuss over martinis later. But to me, this was my life, my worth, my identity being systematically dismantled for public consumption. What hurt most wasn't just James's cruel characterization. It was that I had spent years believing I was building something meaningful with him, a partnership, a family, a legacy, only to discover I had merely been fulfilling a role in his carefully curated life story. The beautiful, agreeable wife who made him look successful. The perfect hostess who charmed his clients. The appropriate mother for his child. An acquisition, not a partner. When the judge called for a brief recess, my attorney, Vivian, touched my arm gently. "Let's get some air," she murmured. I nodded, grateful for the momentary escape. The walls of the courtroom had begun to feel suffocating, the eyes following me like physical pressure against my skin. Outside, I leaned against a stone column, closed my eyes, and for the first time in months, allowed myself to feel the full weight of what was happening. The humiliation, the rage, the profound disbelief that someone I had devoted my life to could reduce me so callously to an ornament, a possession that had outlived its usefulness. And yet, amidst all that darkness, I felt something unexpected stirring inside me. Something that felt strangely like relief. James had finally said out loud what he'd clearly been thinking for years. The pretense was over. The mask had fallen. I no longer had to wonder if I was imagining his contempt or exaggerating his dismissiveness. The gloves were off. And in that moment, I no longer had to pretend either. No more walking on eggshells. No more careful management of his moods. No more diminishing myself to fit into the narrow space he'd allocated for me in his world. I straightened my posture and caught my reflection in a nearby window. I didn't see a trophy wife staring back at me. I saw a woman who was tired but unbowed. Someone with more resilience, intelligence, and dignity than James had ever acknowledged or perhaps even noticed. A woman who had endured far more than anyone in that courtroom could possibly imagine. As I adjusted the collar of my conservative blue dress and prepared to return to the battlefield that our marriage had become, I made a decision. If James wanted to paint me as nothing more than a decorative object in his life, I would show him, and everyone else, exactly who I really was. I would reclaim the voice, the power, and the identity that had been gradually stripped from me over 15 years of subtle erasure. He thought he knew me. He thought he had me categorized, contained, and cornered. But James had made a critical error in his carefully plotted strategy. He had underestimated me. He had mistaken my accommodation for weakness, my patience for lack of agency, my silence for emptiness. His words were meant to diminish me. Instead, they had liberated me. As Vivian and I walked back toward the courtroom doors, she squeezed my arm. "Ready?" she asked, her eyes searching mine for signs of breakdown. Smiled. A real smile, not the practiced perfect one I'd worn at James's side at hundreds of corporate functions. "More than you know," I replied. "Because here's the thing about trophies. They might appear decorative and silent, but they're also made of solid metal. They're built to last. And in the right hands, they can be surprisingly heavy." James wanted a show? I would give him one, but it wouldn't be the performance he was expecting. You know what's strange about Humiliation? The way time seems to stretch and compress simultaneously. In that courtroom, hearing James call me a trophy wife, seconds felt like hours. Yet somehow the moment was over before I could fully process it. When we returned from the recess, I sat straighter in my chair, my face composed into what my daughter, Olivia, used to call my museum face, polite, pleasant, and completely unreadable. The face I'd perfected at hundreds of James's corporate events. James's attorney continued laying out their case, occasionally glancing at me as if expecting to see cracks forming in my facade. "Mrs. Harrington has enjoyed a life of exceptional privilege," he said, his voice dripping with practiced sympathy. "A Fifth Avenue apartment, vacation homes in the Hamptons and Aspen, a household staff, unlimited shopping allowances, all provided by my client's exceptional business acumen and hard work." I could feel Vivian tensing beside me, pen poised over, her legal pad, ready to object if necessary. But I placed my hand gently on her wrist. Let them talk. Let them show exactly who they are. James sat at his table, exuding confidence in his impeccably tailored Tom Ford suit. He nodded occasionally at his attorney's points, his expression a careful blend of disappointment and magnanimity. The performance of a reasonable man dealing with an unreasonable situation. I knew that expression intimately, had seen it deployed against business rivals, difficult clients, and eventually, against me. While my client acknowledges Mrs. Harrington's role as a mother to their daughter, his attorney continued, we contend that her contribution to the accumulation of marital assets was minimal at best. Mrs. Harrington came into this marriage with no significant assets or career. She has no college degree, no professional experience, and no marketable skills beyond social graces that, while valuable in certain contexts, do not constitute economic contribution. No marketable skills. The phrase landed like a physical blow. 15 years of managing multiple households, organizing charity galas that raised millions, maintaining relationships with everyone from Fortune 500 CEOs to the building's maintenance staff, all while raising our daughter to be the accomplished young woman she was becoming. All of it dismissed as worthless. I remembered the Eleanor who had existed before James, 22 years old, working 2 jobs to put herself through community, college, determined to become an interior designer. The Eleanor with plans, ambitions, and a voice of her own. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Eleanor who believed James when he said, "Why struggle when I can give you the world? Your job will be making our life beautiful." Isn't that better than wasting your talents on strangers? It had sounded romantic then. A partnership where his business prowess and my aesthetic sensibilities would combine to create a perfect life. I didn't understand that I was agreeing to. The slow, systematic dismantling of my independence. First, it was leaving school because we needed me to focus on setting up our new home. Then it was postponing my plans to start a small design consultancy because we were at a critical juncture in his career. Then came pregnancy, motherhood, and the increasing social obligations of being Mrs. James Harrington. Each transition came with golden handcuffs disguised as gifts, jewelry to celebrate abandoning my education, a larger home that required more of my attention, introductions to influential people who only saw me as James's beautiful wife. By the time I realized what was happening, the independent woman I had been was barely recognizable, even to myself. As James's attorney droned on about my supposed lack of contribution, I found my mind drifting to a conversation from the previous Christmas. Olivia, home from her first semester at Princeton, had asked me a question while we were decorating the tree, a rare moment when James was occupied with work calls in his study. "Mom," she'd said, studying an ornament I'd hand-painted years ago, "did you ever want something different? Something that was just yours?" The question had caught me off guard, coming from my usually self-absorbed teenager. "What do you mean? Sweetheart?" "I mean, before Dad. Before me. Did you have dreams of your own?" I'd paused, ornament in hand, suddenly aware of how long it had been since I'd thought about those early ambitions. "I did," I finally said. "I wanted to design spaces that made people feel something, peaceful, or energized or inspired. I was actually pretty good at it." Olivia had looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. "What happened?" "Life happened," I'd answered, trying to keep my tone light. "Choices, compromises, the usual." She'd been quiet for a moment before saying, "You know, my roommate's mom started her own company when she was 45, after her divorce." Then she'd hung another ornament and changed the subject. That conversation had planted a seed, one that had been quietly germinating ever since. Sitting in that courtroom, listening to myself being reduced to an ornamental expense in James's life, I felt that seed suddenly break through the soil. James's attorney finally concluded his opening statement with what he clearly considered a generous offer. "My client is prepared to provide Mrs. Harrington with the apartment in Aspen, a monthly allowance commensurate with a reasonable standard of living, and coverage of their daughter's educational expenses. This settlement acknowledges her years as his spouse while recognizing that the vast majority of assets were created through Mr. Harrington's business ventures, in which Mrs. Harrington had no meaningful participation." The courtroom was silent for a moment. Then the judge turned to Vivian. "Counselor, your response?" Vivian stood, buttoning her blazer with deliberate calm. "Your Honor, before I present our case, may I confer briefly with my client?" The judge nodded, and Vivian leaned toward me, whispering, "We anticipated this approach. Are you still certain about our strategy? It's aggressive and will likely provoke significant backlash." I met her eyes steadily. "Absolutely certain." She studied my face for a moment, then nodded once. "Then let's proceed as planned." As Vivian turned back to address the court, I caught James watching me, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his features for the first time. In 15 years of marriage, he'd never seen this version of Eleanor, the one who wasn't accommodating, wasn't smoothing things over, wasn't prioritizing his comfort above all else. It was time he met her. The first time I met James Harrington, I wasn't supposed to be at that gallery opening at all. I was filling in for my roommate, who'd called in sick to her catering job. Her boss had been desperate, And the extra money meant I could finally fix the perpetually leaking faucet in our tiny apartment bathroom. I was 22, juggling two jobs while studying interior design, a community college program I was paying for myself. My parents, a high school teacher and a nurse from a small town in Pennsylvania, had contributed what they could, but their resources were limited. Everything else was on me, and I was proud of that fact. The gallery was showcasing an up-and-coming, modern artist whose abstract work commanded prices that could have paid my rent for years. As I circulated with a tray of champagne flutes, I noticed a tall, impeccably dressed man in his early 30s studying a particularly vibrant piece. Unlike most guests who moved quickly from painting to painting, photographing more than observing, he seemed genuinely engaged with the artwork. "What do you think it represents?" he asked, surprising me as I approached with my tray. The question wasn't condescending or flirtatious. He seemed genuinely interested in my opinion. "Honestly?" I said, forgetting momentarily that I was supposed to be invisible. "I think it's about containment and escape. See how the blue keeps trying to break through the structured pattern, but it never quite makes it out." He studied me with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable, but somehow wasn't. "Interesting. The gallery description calls it harmonic dissonance and goes on about vibration and frequency." I laughed. "That's gallery speak for 'please buy this expensive painting.'" He smiled then, a genuine smile that transformed his serious face. "I'm James Harrington," he said, extending his hand. "Eleanor Wade," I replied, shifting my tray to shake his hand. "And I should get back to work before I get fired from yet another catering gig." "Wait," he said. "What's your real job, if not this? Student by day, bookstore clerk by evening, occasional caterer by night." I shrugged. "The glamorous life?" "Studying what?" "Interior design." His eyebrows rose slightly. "So you have an eye for both art and space." "I try," I said, already, backing away. "Enjoy the exhibition, Mr. Harrington." "James," he corrected. "And I'd like to continue our conversation when your shift ends, if you're interested." I hesitated, weighing my exhaustion against my curiosity. "I'm off at 10. "Perfect. I'll wait." And he did. When I emerged from the back room at 10:15, certain he would have left, he was sitting patiently in the empty gallery, jacket off, scrolling through his phone. He took me to a small 24-hour cafe where we talked until nearly 2 in the morning about art, design, our backgrounds, aspirations. He listened when I spoke about wanting to create spaces that functioned as both sanctuary and inspiration. He told me about building his investment firm from scratch after walking away from his father's manufacturing business. "I wanted to make it on my own terms," he explained. "No legacy appointments, no favors called in, just my ability to recognize value where others don't." By the time he walked me to the subway, I was half in love with his mind, his ambition, his apparent respect for mine. When he asked for my number, I gave it without hesitation. Our courtship was a whirlwind. James introduced me to a New York I'd only glimpsed through windows: Michelin-starred restaurants, private museum tours, weekends in the Hamptons. He sent books on designers he thought would interest me, listened intently to my opinions, and seemed genuinely impressed by my ability to transform spaces on a shoestring budget. "You have an exceptional eye," he told me after I'd rearranged the furniture in his Tribeca loft, transforming it from a sterile showcase into something actually livable. "You see possibilities others miss." I basked in his appreciation, in being truly seen by someone who himself was so impressive. When he proposed 6 months later, presenting both a ring and the keys to a brownstone he'd purchased for us to renovate together, I said yes without hesitation. "We'll make it our first project," he promised. "Your vision, my resources, the perfect partnership." The brownstone renovation became my full-time focus. With James's encouragement, I took a leave of absence from my studies. "Just until the house is finished," he insisted. This is practical experience worth 10 degrees. I threw myself into the project, sourcing unique materials, working directly with contractors, creating a home that told our story through carefully curated spaces. James was delighted with the results, proudly showing it off to friends and colleagues. Eleanor has transformed this place, he would say, his arm around my waist. She sees the potential in everything. That's why we're perfect together. The wedding was featured in a society magazine, a far cry from the small, intimate ceremony I'd once imagined. James hired a planner, but insisted I oversee the aesthetic elements. I trust your taste implicitly, he said, kissing my forehead. Whatever makes you happy makes me happy. I didn't notice then how decisions were subtly guided, the guest list dominated by his business associates, the venue selected from options he pre-approved, my dress chosen from designers he suggested. Each choice seemed like mine in the moment, yet somehow the result perfectly aligned with the image James wanted to project. After our honeymoon in the Maldives, I mentioned returning to school to finish my degree. Why? James asked, genuine confusion in his voice. You've already proven your talent with our home. Why waste time on coursework when you could be applying your skills to our life? Put that way, it made a certain sense. Besides, I was already pregnant, an unexpected but welcome surprise that shifted my priorities once again. Olivia's birth 9 months later sealed my transformation from independent student to Mrs. James Harrington. The baby required attention. Our growing social obligations required planning. James's rapidly expanding business required a flawless home base for entertaining clients and partners. You're so much more valuable here, James would say when I occasionally mentioned resuming my education or taking on small design projects. Olivia needs you. I need you. And frankly, my love, we don't need the money from some entry-level design job. The golden handcuffs tightened so gradually I barely felt them. Each suggestion came wrapped in praise, each limitation presented as a privilege. I managed our growing household staff, organized charity events, curated our expanding art collection, and raised our daughter, all while maintaining the perfect appearance expected of James Harrington's wife. Looking back, I can pinpoint the exact moment I should have recognized what was happening. We were hosting a dinner for potential investors, and I'd spent weeks ensuring every detail was perfect. The conversation turned to a renovation project one guest was undertaking. You should consult Eleanor, James said. She has an extraordinary eye for design. The guest looked interested. Do you take clients, Mrs. Harrington? Before I could respond, James laughed. Oh, Eleanor's talents are exclusively for our benefit. Why share when I can keep her brilliance all to myself? It was said with such charm that everyone, including me, smiled. But underneath his words was a clear message. Eleanor belongs to me. Her abilities are my property. I had gone from being a partner to being part of the portfolio, another asset in James Harrington's carefully curated collection. The first decade of our marriage followed a pattern I only recognized in retrospect. Each year brought greater material comfort and less personal autonomy. Our homes multiplied. The Manhattan apartment, the Hampton house, the Aspen retreat, each more lavish than the last. Each one I designed and decorated to perfection, creating spaces that were featured in architectural magazines, always with captions like, The Harrington Residence, where investment mogul James Harrington and his wife Eleanor entertain the elite of New York society. His wife Eleanor. Never Eleanor Harrington, interior designer. Never my name alone. James's control tightened in subtle increments. First came the joint accounts with spending alerts. Just so I can make sure no one is using our cards fraudulently, he explained. You wouldn't believe how common that is. I didn't question when those alerts evolved into conversations about my purchases. Darling, do you really need another decorative vase? Or, that's the third time you've ordered from that boutique this month. Then came the calendar sharing. It's more efficient if we can see each other's schedules, he insisted. Soon, my plans required his approval, often rescinded at the last minute for more important commitments involving his business associates. "Eleanor can't make lunch on Thursday after all," he'd inform my few remaining friends without consulting me. "Something's come up." That something was usually a lunch with a client's wife or a potential investor's partner. Connections James deemed more valuable than my personal relationships. My world narrowed to the parameters James established. I maintained our homes, managed Olivia's education and activities, hosted flawless events, and accompanied James to functions where I was expected to be charming, beautiful, and, above all, supportive. "My secret weapon," he would say, introducing me to business associates. "Eleanor knows exactly how to make people feel special." It was meant as a compliment, but the subtext was clear. My value lay in how I could serve his interests, not in any intrinsic worth of my own. The isolation happened so gradually I barely noticed. First, we moved from the brownstone to a larger apartment farther uptown, away from the few friends I'd made in the neighborhood. Then my college roommates' invitations were repeatedly declined due to conflicts with James's schedule, until they eventually stopped coming. My parents, intimidated by James's wealth and status, visited less frequently. When they did, James was politely distant, making it clear they were outsiders in our world. After my father's heart attack when Olivia was 7, James insisted on paying for the best medical care, a generosity that created an uncomfortable sense of obligation. Their visits became even rarer, our conversations more superficial. "They're simple people," James would say after their departures. "They mean well, but they don't understand our lifestyle." Our lifestyle. As if I had chosen it, rather than having it incrementally imposed upon me. Olivia became my primary focus, my project, my purpose, my connection to my former self. I threw myself into motherhood with the same creativity and attention to detail I'd once applied to design. I read to her constantly, created elaborate art projects, took her to museums and parks whenever James's schedule permitted. But even there, James's influence was pervasive. He hired tutors before she entered kindergarten, enrolled her in the most prestigious private school in Manhattan, and scheduled her for activities that would develop her competitive edge: fencing, Mandarin lessons, advanced mathematics. "She needs to understand excellence from the beginning," he insisted when I suggested some activities might be too intense for a child her age. "The world won't make accommodations for her, Eleanor. We need to prepare her. We, as if we were equal partners in these decisions." By the time Olivia was 10, our home operated like a finely tuned machine. Staff managed the daily operations, tutors and instructors developed Olivia's talents, and I orchestrated the entire production while maintaining the perfect appearance of effortless elegance. If I occasionally felt a hollowness, a yearning for something that was truly mine, I pushed it aside. After all, I had everything a woman could want. Hadn't James reminded me of that often enough? The breaking point didn't come dramatically. There was no singular catastrophic event, no Hollywood moment of betrayal or cruelty. Instead, it was a quiet accumulation of dignity eroded, identity diminished, and spirit contained. I remember the evening clearly. We were hosting a dinner for a potential European investor and his wife. The conversation had turned to art. Specifically, the large abstract canvas hanging in our dining room, the same artist whose work James and I had discussed the night we met. "It's extraordinary," the investor's wife commented. "Such emotion in the composition." "Yes," James agreed. "I've always been drawn to the way it represents containment and escape, the blue element trying to break through the structured pattern, but never quite succeeding." My words. My exact interpretation from 12 years earlier, now presented as his original insight. I looked across the table at my husband, waiting for him to acknowledge me, to include me in the conversation that had once connected us. But his eyes slid past mine without recognition, already moving on to his next point about investment strategies in volatile markets. That night, after our guests had departed and James had retired to his study for a final conference call, I stood alone, before the painting. The blue was still there, still trapped within the rigid structure, still yearning for escape. But now I saw something I'd missed before: how the blue had gradually spread throughout the composition, infiltrating spaces where it once had been excluded, preparing for an inevitable breakthrough. I studied my reflection in the glass covering. The canvas, a woman approaching 40, elegantly dressed, perfectly groomed, and completely hollow. A woman who had spent 15 years being exactly what someone else needed her to be: a trophy wife. The term I would later hear in court hadn't occurred to me then, but the reality of it had finally become undeniable. I was an acquisition, a display, piece valuable for how I completed James's collection, but not for who I was independently. The next morning, I opened my laptop and created something I hadn't possessed in years: a private email account James couldn't access. I then did something even more revolutionary. I made an appointment with a therapist whose name James would never know. Dr. Sarah Chen specialized in helping women reclaim their autonomy after years in controlling relationships. In her serene office, with its views of Central Park, I began the slow process of excavating Eleanor Wade from beneath years of Mrs. James Harrington. "When did you last make a significant decision without considering his reaction first?" she asked during our third session. I sat in silence, unable to remember a single instance. "That's where we'll start," she said gently. "With small choices that are completely yours." Those small choices became my secret rebellion. I donated to charities James wouldn't approve of. I read books he would find frivolous. I reconnected with my former roommate for coffee during times Olivia was at school and James was at work. I also began documenting everything, keeping records of financial transactions, copying important papers, noting patterns of control. Not because I was planning to leave, not yet, but because information had become my first tentative grasp at power. "Knowledge is armor," Dr. Chen told me. "Gather it while you decide your next steps." For 6 months, I lived this double life: the perfect Mrs. Harrington on the surface, the awakening Eleanor underneath. I might have continued indefinitely, finding small pockets of self-determination within my gilded cage, if not for what happened next. It was a Tuesday afternoon in October when I found it. James was in London on business, Olivia was at school, and I was searching for a missing earring in his closet, a space I rarely entered since his valet managed his wardrobe. The earring wasn't there, but as I moved shoeboxes on the upper shelf, a manila envelope fell, spilling papers across the pristine carpet. As I gathered them, a document caught my eye. A prenuptial agreement with my signature on it. A prenuptial agreement I had never seen, much less signed. I stood frozen, the paper trembling in my hand. My signature was perfect. Too perfect. This wasn't a document I'd forgotten signing. This was forgery, expertly executed. I sank onto the edge of the bed, examining the papers more carefully. The agreement stated that in the event of divorce, I would receive a fixed settlement, regardless of the length of our marriage or the wealth accumulated during it. The amount was substantial by normal standards, but a pittance compared to James's actual worth. More disturbingly, I would forfeit even that if I engaged in behavior damaging to James Harrington's reputation or business interests. The language was broad enough to include almost anything James might find objectionable. With shaking hands, I photographed every page, then carefully returned the envelope to its hiding place. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my fingertips. This wasn't just control, this was premeditated fraud. James had been protecting himself against me from the very beginning. I called Dr. Chen and scheduled an emergency appointment for that afternoon. In her office, I paced as I described my discovery. "He forged my signature," I said, my voice rising. He created a legal document to ensure I would have no claim to anything no matter what happened. This is significant, Eleanor, Dr. Chen said, her calm tone a counterpoint to my agitation. Not just legally, but psychologically. How does this discovery change how you see your marriage? The question stopped me mid-pace. How did it change things? Strangely, beneath the shock and betrayal, I felt something close to validation. It means I wasn't imagining it, I said slowly. The control, the calculation, it was all deliberate. He never saw me as a partner. From the very beginning, I was an acquisition with a potential liability. Dr. Chen nodded. And knowing this, now what do you want to do? The answer came with surprising clarity. I want out, but I want more than freedom. I want recognition of what I've contributed. I want what's rightfully mine. That will be difficult, she warned. Men like James rarely relinquish control without a fight. I know, I said. But for the first time, I'm ready to fight back. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about all the years I'd diminished myself to fit James's vision of the perfect wife. All the skills I'd set aside, all the friendships I'd let fade, all the parts of myself I'd hidden away because they didn't serve his purposes. Around 3 a.m., I got up and went to Olivia's room. She was at that age, 16, where childhood and adulthood overlap in unpredictable ways. Watching her sleep, face relaxed and vulnerable in a way it rarely was during waking hours, I felt a surge of resolve. What example was I setting for my daughter by accepting erasure? What was I teaching her about her own worth as a woman? The next morning, I made 2 phone calls that would change everything. The first was to Vivian Rodriguez, a divorce attorney, known for her strategic brilliance and unshakable composure. The second was to Michael Torres, a forensic accountant recommended by a woman I'd met in Dr. Chen's waiting room. I met them separately, first in coffee shops, later in Vivian's office. I shared everything: the forged prenup, the financial control, the years of psychological containment. I handed over copies of tax returns I'd secretly photographed, investment statements I'd discovered, property documents I'd collected. He's hidden assets, Michael confirmed after his preliminary investigation. Offshore accounts, shell companies, undervalued properties, classic patterns for someone preparing to protect wealth in a divorce. So he's been planning this for some time, I said, oddly calm despite the revelation. Years, most likely, Michael nodded. People like your husband don't improvise. They strategize. Vivian was equally direct. We have 2 significant advantages, Eleanor. First, the forged prenup. That's not just a divorce issue, that's potential criminal fraud. Second, his certainty that you're exactly what he's made you believe you are, decorative, dependent, and defeatable. But how do we prove the prenup is forged? I asked. It's my word against his, and his carries more weight. Vivian smiled for the first time since we'd met. Leave that to me. More importantly, are you prepared for what comes next? James won't surrender anything without a battle, and it will get ugly. He'll use everything. Your lack of formal education, your financial dependence, any personal vulnerability he can exploit. I thought about the blue in that painting, spreading quietly throughout the composition, preparing for its moment. I've been preparing for this battle longer than he knows, I said. I just didn't realize it until now. The next 3 months were an education in strategic warfare. While maintaining the appearance of the perfect wife, I worked with Vivian and Michael to document James's financial deceptions. I reconnected with old friends who could testify to my contributions to our marriage and homes. I even reached out to former business associates of James's who had fallen from favor, discovering patterns of manipulation that extended far beyond our marriage. Most challenging was maintaining the facade at home. Each dinner prepared to his specifications, each social event navigated flawlessly, each night lying beside him in bed, all while knowing I was dismantling the foundations of the life he'd constructed. I chose Thanksgiving weekend to serve him, with divorce papers, a calculated decision made with Vivian's guidance. The holiday meant his usual legal team would be largely unavailable, giving us a crucial head start. James was in his study when the doorbell rang. I listened from the kitchen as our housekeeper showed in the courier, as James's voice rose in disbelief as his footsteps approached with uncharacteristic heaviness. He stood in the kitchen doorway, papers clutched in his hand, face flushed with an emotion I'd rarely seen on him. Genuine surprise. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, waving the documents. I continued slicing vegetables for the dinner he would no longer be eating. "Divorce papers," I replied, my voice steadier than I'd expected. "My lawyer thought it best to serve them formally." "Your lawyer?" He spat the words. "Since when do you have a lawyer?" I set down the knife and turned to face him fully. "Since I discovered the prenuptial agreement you forged my signature on." The color drained from his face so quickly I thought he might faint. In that moment, I saw something I'd never witnessed in 15 years of marriage. James Harrington caught completely off guard. "That's absurd," he finally said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You signed that document. We both did." "No, James. You signed for both of us. And that's just the beginning of what I know." His eyes narrowed, calculation replacing shock. "Whatever you think you know, whatever you think you're entitled to, you're mistaken. No court will side with you over me. You're nothing without me, Eleanor." "Nothing." I smiled then, a genuine smile that seemed to unnerve him further. "That's exactly what I expected you to say, and exactly why you'll lose everything." "You can't beat me at this," he said, his voice hardening. "I've protected myself from every contingency, including an ungrateful wife who's forgotten her place." "My place," I repeated, the words like pebbles in my mouth. "That's what this has always been about, hasn't it? Keeping me in my place." "Your place is the one I created for you," he snapped. "Without me, you'd still be serving canapes at gallery openings. Everything you have, I gave you. And there it was, the truth I'd been slowly accepting for months. In James's mind, I wasn't a partner who had contributed to our life together. I was a possession he had purchased, an investment he had made, a trophy he had earned." "You're wrong," I said quietly, "and I'm going to enjoy watching you learn just how wrong you are." The weeks following my confrontation with James unfolded like a high-stakes chess match. He recovered quickly from his initial shock, mobilizing his considerable resources against me with ruthless efficiency. First came the financial siege. Credit cards canceled. Access to our joint accounts frozen. Staff at all 3 homes instructed not to take direction from me. Even the weekly grocery delivery was suspended. It was a calculated move designed to remind me of my dependence and force me back into compliance through desperation. "He's trying to starve you out," Vivian observed during our emergency meeting the following day. Classic intimidation tactic. But James had underestimated my preparation. The separate bank account I'd established months earlier contained enough to sustain me through the initial battle. The small apartment I'd secretly leased in Chelsea, modest by Harrington standards but comfortable enough, was ready when I needed to leave the Fifth Avenue residence. "I won't be forced out of my home," I told Vivian firmly. "Not permanently," she agreed. "But tactically, it might be better to withdraw temporarily. Let him think he's won this round while we prepare our counterattack." That night, I packed 2 suitcases with essentials: clothes, personal documents, irreplaceable photographs of Olivia's childhood. As I moved through the master bedroom, selecting items with careful deliberation, I caught sight of myself in the full-length mirror. I barely recognized the woman staring back at me, not because she looked different, but because her eyes held something I hadn't seen in years: purpose, clarity, determination. This wasn't the carefully composed face of Mrs. James Harrington, perpetual hostess and ornamental wife. This was Eleanor Wade, strategic and resolute. The most difficult part was explaining to Olivia. At 16, she was perceptive enough to sense the tension, but still young enough to fear the dissolution of her family. I found her in her room, headphones on, textbooks spread across her bed. "I need to talk to you," I said after she reluctantly removed her headphones. Her eyes immediately went to the suitcase by my side. "Are you leaving?" she asked, her voice smaller than I'd heard it in years. I sat beside her on the bed. "Just for a little while. Your father and I are separating." "Because of the divorce papers?" Dad's been on the phone all day with lawyers. Shouldn't have been surprised she knew. Olivia had always been observant, always listening when adults thought she wasn't paying attention. "Yes," I said simply. "Things between your father and me have been complicated for a long time." She twisted a strand of hair around her finger, a nervous habit from childhood she'd mostly outgrown. "Is it because of his affair?" The question hit me like a physical blow. "What affair?" Olivia looked at me with a mixture of surprise and pity. "With Diane Lowell, from his office. I thought you knew." Diane Lowell, James's elegant, efficient chief of operations, the woman he'd hired 3 years ago, whose rapid rise through the company had raised eyebrows even among James's normally deferential staff. "How do you know about this?" I asked, working to keep my voice steady. Olivia shrugged with teenage nonchalance that couldn't quite mask her discomfort. "I've seen how they look at each other at company events, and I overheard Dad on the phone. With her last month when you were in Connecticut visiting Grandma. He doesn't talk to business associates that way." I absorbed this information with surprising equanimity. The betrayal should have devastated me, but instead, it felt like the final confirmation of what I already knew. Our marriage had been a transaction, not a partnership, and James had simply found a newer model to replace the original. "No," I said finally. "That's not why I'm leaving, though it certainly doesn't change my decision." "Where will you go?" Olivia asked. "I have an apartment in Chelsea. Nothing fancy, but it's comfortable. You're welcome there anytime. In fact, I'm hoping you'll stay with me part of the time." She bit her lip. "Dad won't like that." "No, he won't," I agreed. "But this isn't just his decision to make, and it isn't just mine either. You're 16, old enough to have a say in your own life." She studied me with those perceptive eyes, so like James's in color but entirely her own in their emotional intelligence. "You seem different," she said finally. "I am different," I acknowledged. "I'm becoming who I was always meant to be." After a long pause, she asked, "Can I see the apartment this weekend?" It wasn't a commitment, but it was a beginning. I hugged her tightly, inhaling the familiar scent of her shampoo, allowing myself this moment of connection before the battle ahead. "Anytime," I promised. "I'll text you the address." Leaving the Fifth Avenue apartment that night was surreal. As the elevator descended from the penthouse to the lobby, I felt a weight lifting, not just the metaphorical burden of my marriage, but the physical pressure of constant performance, constant vigilance, constant accommodation. For the first time in 15 years, I didn't have to be Mrs. James Harrington. I could simply be Eleanor. The apartment in Chelsea was both a refuge and a statement of intent. I'd furnished it sparsely but thoughtfully. Quality pieces chosen for comfort rather than impression. Walls painted in colors James would have deemed too bold. Bookshelves filled with volumes I'd been reading secretly for months. It wasn't large or luxurious, but it was entirely mine. That first night, I slept better than I had in years, despite the uncertainty looming ahead. The absence of James's presence, his restless energy, his subtle dominance even in sleep, was a liberation I hadn't anticipated. The next morning, I awoke to an eruption of text messages and missed calls. James, alternating between threats and attempts at manipulation. His lawyers, demanding immediate discussions. Friends, or rather James's friends, expressing concern and confusion. I responded to none of them. Instead, I showered, dressed in jeans and a sweater rather than my usual carefully curated ensemble, and walked to a nearby cafe for breakfast. The simple pleasure of choosing what to eat without calculating how it would be perceived felt revolutionary. Over coffee and pastry, at a small table by the window, I reviewed the documents Vivian had prepared. The legal strategy was complex but elegant in its construction, a multifaceted approach that would challenge James on several fronts simultaneously. The forged prenuptial agreement was our most powerful weapon, but we had others. Evidence of financial concealment, documentation of psychological control, and now, thanks to Olivia's unwitting revelation, potential ammunition regarding infidelity. As I annotated the documents with my own observations, a text from an unknown number flashed. On my phone, "Eleanor, this is Diane Lowell. We need to talk. Not about James. About what he's been doing with the European investments." I stared at the message, mind racing. Diane Lowell, James's mistress, his trusted operational officer, reaching out to me directly. It could be a trap, an attempt to gather information or evidence of my intentions. But the specific mention of the European investments, a segment of James's business I knew he'd been particularly secretive about, suggested something more. "I'll have my lawyer contact you," I replied cautiously. Her response was immediate. "No lawyers. This isn't for the divorce. This is about the SEC investigation he doesn't know is coming." SEC investigation. The Securities and Exchange Commission, a federal agency with the power to investigate securities, fraud, insider trading, and other financial misconduct. My coffee grew cold as I considered the implications. If James was under SEC scrutiny, it could explain his increasingly erratic behavior over the past year, the late-night phone calls, the unexplained trips, the uncharacteristic outbursts of temper. It could also explain why he'd been moving assets, offshore with greater urgency, preparing for a storm I hadn't realized was brewing. I texted Vivian immediately, forwarding Diane's messages. Her response was swift and unequivocal. "Don't meet her alone. Don't discuss anything by text. I'll arrange a secure meeting." As I left the cafe, I felt a strange sense of clarity. The James Harrington I had married, controlled, strategic, invulnerable, was an illusion as carefully constructed as the persona of his perfect wife. Behind the facade of power and success lurked something darker, something potentially criminal. For 15 years, I had diminished myself to complement his magnitude. I had accepted his dismissal of my contributions, his containment of my potential, his redefinition of my identity. I had allowed myself to become the trophy wife he wanted rather than the woman I was meant to be. No more. The balance was shifting, the structure was weakening, and the blue was finally breaking through. The meeting with Diane Lowell took place 3 days later in Vivian's office. The space was deliberately neutral, a conference room with no personal touches, just a polished table, comfortable chairs, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a rainy Manhattan afternoon. Diane arrived precisely on time, impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than a month's rent for my Chelsea apartment. I'd seen her at company. Functions, of course, always at James's side, always efficient and elegant. But this was the first time I'd really looked at her, not as an extension of my husband, but as an individual with her own motivations. She was younger than me, mid-30s perhaps, with the kind of confident posture that came from navigating male-dominated spaces successfully. When our eyes met, I expected to see triumph, or perhaps pity. Instead, I saw something unexpected: respect. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," she said, taking the seat across from me. Vivian sat at the head of the table, a legal pad and recorder, between us. "Let's be clear about something," I replied. "I didn't come here to discuss my marriage or to make deals about the divorce. Neither did I. Diane said with surprising candor. What exists between James and me is irrelevant to why I contacted you. Vivian leaned forward slightly. Then why exactly are we here, Ms. Lowell? Diane reached into her briefcase and withdrew a thumb drive, placing it deliberately on the table between us. Because James Harrington is not just controlling and manipulative, she said, her voice steady. He's engaged in securities fraud, market manipulation, and money laundering. And, unlike his marriage, these aren't problems he can solve by bullying people into submission. For the next hour, Diane outlined a complex scheme involving European investment funds, artificially inflated valuations, and offshore accounts used to conceal both the sources and movements of millions of dollars. I didn't realize what was happening at first, she explained. The irregularities were subtle, buried under layers of legitimate transactions. By the time I understood what I was actually facilitating, I was already implicated. Why come forward now? Vivian asked, the skepticism evident in her tone. Diane's composed exterior cracked slightly. Because 3 weeks ago, I discovered James has been setting me up as the fall person. There are documents with my signature. Documents I never signed, authorizing the most questionable transactions. Sound familiar? It did. The forged prenuptial agreement suddenly seemed like part of a larger pattern rather than an isolated deception. What's on the drive? I asked, nodding toward the small device between us. Everything, Diane replied. Transaction records, communication logs, account details, enough to prove what he's been doing and who's really responsible. And what do you want in return? Vivian asked. Immunity, Diane said simply. I've already spoken with an SEC attorney conditionally. If I provide evidence and testimony, they'll consider me a cooperative witness rather than a co-conspirator. But I need protection from James, too. What kind of protection? I asked. He'll destroy me, professionally, when he realizes I've turned on him. I need financial security while I rebuild my career. Vivian and I exchanged glances. The implications were clear. We had leverage far beyond what we'd initially imagined. James wasn't just fighting a divorce. He was potentially facing federal charges. We'll need our financial expert to verify this. Information, Vivian said, reaching for the thumb drive. Diane nodded. Of course, but don't take too long. The SEC investigation is advancing, and James is getting nervous. He's accelerating the offshore transfers. Soon there won't be anything left to claim in the divorce. After Diane left, Vivian and I sat in silence for several moments, absorbing the magnitude of what we'd just learned. If this is legitimate, Vivian finally said, it changes everything. Is it enough to invalidate the prenup? I asked. The prenup was already vulnerable because of the forgery. This is much bigger. She tapped her fingers thoughtfully on the table. We need to move carefully. Financial fraud allegations could tie up his assets in federal proceedings, potentially putting them beyond reach for the divorce settlement. So, what do we do? We use this information strategically, Vivian said, her mind clearly racing through scenarios. Not as our primary weapon, but as leverage to force a favorable settlement before the SEC moves in. That evening, in my apartment, I spread our growing collection of evidence across the dining table. Financial records, property documents, the forged prenup, and now Diane's explosive revelations. The pieces of a puzzle that revealed not just the dissolution of a marriage, but the potential collapse of James Harrington's carefully constructed empire. My phone buzzed with a text from Olivia. Coming to see the apartment tomorrow after school. Dad's furious. I smiled despite the tension of the day. My daughter, making her own choices despite her father's disapproval. Perhaps she had inherited more of Eleanor Wade than either of us had realized. The next morning, Michael Torres called with his preliminary assessment of Diane's information. It's legitimate, he confirmed, and it's damning. Classic pump-and-dump schemes with a sophisticated laundering operation layered on top. The SEC will have a field day with this. How vulnerable does this make him? I asked. Extremely, Michael replied. We're talking potential criminal charges, not just civil penalties. Prison time. And that's not counting what the European financial authorities might do once they catch wind of this. The knowledge should have been satisfying. Evidence that the man who had diminished me for years was himself built on deception. Instead, I felt a complex mixture of vindication and sadness. Not for James, but for the years I'd spent admiring a man who didn't exist. When Olivia arrived that afternoon, the evidence was carefully stored away. This moment wasn't about James's crimes or our divorce strategy. It was about rebuilding a relationship with my daughter outside the dynamics of the Harrington household. It's smaller than I expected, she said, examining the apartment with the critical eye of a teenager accustomed to luxury. It's temporary, I explained. Just until the divorce is settled. She wandered from room to room, trailing her fingers along bookshelves, examining the simple art I'd hung on the walls. In the small second bedroom I'd set up for her, she paused, noticing the framed photograph on the nightstand. Olivia at 10, laughing as she built a sandcastle on a beach in the Hamptons. I remember this day, she said softly. You helped me build that massive moat system. Dad kept saying we were wasting time on something the tide would wash away. I didn't think it was a waste, I replied, standing in the doorway. We had fun building it. That was the point. She turned to face me, suddenly looking younger than her 16 years. Why did you stay with him so long, Mom? If you were so unhappy? The question pierced through my carefully constructed explanations. I sat on the edge of the bed, patting the space beside me. After a moment's hesitation, Olivia joined me. I stayed for complicated reasons, I said. Because I thought I could make it work. Because I believed that's what a good wife did. Because I was afraid of failing. I paused, choosing my next words carefully. And I stayed for you. For me? She looked stricken. So it's my fault? No, I said firmly, taking her hand. Never think that. I meant that loving you gave me purpose when I'd lost sight of myself. You were the one true thing in a marriage that had become performative. But you're not staying anymore, she observed. No, I agreed. Because I finally understood that showing you what a strong woman looks like is more important than showing you what an enduring marriage looks like. Even if the marriage isn't real. She was quiet for a long moment, absorbing this. Then she squeezed my hand. I like this version of you, Mom. You seem, I don't know, more like a whole person. The simple observation brought tears to my eyes. My own daughter had seen what I had only recently acknowledged, that in becoming Mrs. James Harrington, I had become less than whole. I'm trying to be, I told her. Every day, a little more. That. Night after Olivia returned to the Fifth Avenue apartment, promising to visit again soon, I received a call from Vivian. James's lawyers reached out, she said without preamble. They're pushing for mediation rather than court proceedings. They're suggesting confidentiality agreements for both parties. He's scared, I realized aloud. He knows a public court. Battle could expose more than just our marital problems. Exactly. But here's the thing, Eleanor. We don't need to show our full hand yet. Let him think this is just about the divorce, the forged prenup, the hidden assets. Keep the SEC angle in reserve. As insurance, I said, understanding her strategy. Precisely. We go to mediation, we make our demands based on what we've already established, and we see how he responds. If he fights too hard, we introduce the new information selectively. It was a chess move worthy of James himself. Calculated, strategic, allowing the opponent to believe they understand the game while holding the real strategy in reserve. When do we start? I asked. They're pushing for next week. I've countered with 3 weeks from now, which gives us time to fully verify Diane's information and strengthen our position. After we hung up, I stood by the window of my apartment, watching the lights of the city blink on as dusk settled over Manhattan. Somewhere out there, James was strategizing too, mobilizing his resources, preparing for battle. He'd been the master, manipulator for so long, controlling the narrative, shaping reality to his advantage. But this time, the woman across the table wouldn't be the Eleanor he thought he knew. This time, she would be someone he had never truly seen, a woman who had finally awakened to her own power. The mediation was scheduled for a Tuesday morning at a prestigious law firm in Midtown, neutral territory selected for its discretion and reputation. I arrived 20 minutes early, deliberately choosing to be present before James. This was the first time we would face each other formally since I'd left the apartment 5 weeks earlier. The waiting area was designed to project understated affluence, leather chairs, abstract art, fresh flowers in simple arrangements. I sat calmly, reviewing notes with Vivian, when the elevator doors opened and James appeared. He wasn't alone. Flanking him were 3 attorneys, not the single mediator we had agreed upon. A power move, designed to intimidate through sheer numerical advantage. Behind them walked a silver-haired man I recognized as Walter Davidson, James's longtime friend and business associate. James himself looked immaculate as always. Bespoke suit, perfect tie, not a hair out of place. But there were subtle signs of strain, a tightness around his eyes, a rigidity in his posture that hadn't been there before. He spotted me immediately, his gaze assessing, calculating. "Eleanor," he said, his voice carrying that familiar blend of authority and condescension. "You're looking rested." The implied criticism that I'd somehow let myself go without his influence might once have unsettled me. Now it merely confirmed how little he understood what was happening. "James," I replied, rising smoothly, "I see you've brought reinforcements. Feeling outnumbered by 2 women?" A flicker of annoyance crossed his face before he masked it with a practiced smile. "Just ensuring all bases are covered. Complex situations require appropriate resources." "Indeed." "They do," Vivian interjected, her tone pleasant but firm. "However, we agreed to 1 mediator, not an entourage, if you'd prefer to reschedule until the original terms can be met." One of James's attorneys stepped forward, hand extended. "Martin Wells. My colleagues and I are simply here to observe and advise. We won't interfere with the mediation process." Vivian didn't take his hand. "Then they can observe from another room." The mediation was arranged as a balanced discussion, not a display of legal firepower. For a moment, tension hung in the air. Then James nodded slightly to his team. 2 of the attorneys and Walter retreated to a conference room across the hall, leaving only Martin beside James. "Satisfied?" James asked, a hint of irritation breaking through his composed exterior. "Equitable," I corrected. "There's a difference." We were shown into a spacious conference room where the mediator, a distinguished former judge named Patricia Hawkins, was already seated at the head of the table. She rose as we entered, her expression giving nothing away. "Mrs. Harrington, Mr. Harrington," she greeted us. "I hope we can make productive use of our time today." "That's our sincere wish as well, Your Honor," James's attorney responded smoothly. Once we were seated, James and Martin on one side, Vivian and I on the other, Judge Hawkins outlined the process. Each side would present their position, followed by discussion of potential resolutions. Everything said was confidential and without prejudice, meaning it couldn't be used in court if mediation failed. "Who would like to begin?" she asked. James nodded to his attorney, who opened an expensive leather portfolio. "Your Honor, my client recognizes that this marriage has reached its natural conclusion. He is prepared to be generous despite the existence of a prenuptial agreement that significantly limits Mrs. Harrington's entitlements." I kept my expression neutral as Martin outlined James's generous offer. The Aspen property, a monthly allowance, coverage of Olivia's educational expenses, and a one-time settlement of $2 million. In exchange, Martin continued. Mrs. Harrington would relinquish all claims to the Manhattan and Hamptons properties, all business interests, investments, art collections, and other assets accumulated during the marriage. She would also sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement regarding all aspects of the marriage and Mr. Harrington's business dealings. Judge Hawkins nodded, making notes. Thank you, Mr. Wells. Ms. Rodriguez? Vivian straightened slightly. Your Honor, we reject this offer in its entirety. Furthermore, we contest the validity of the prenuptial agreement Mr. Wells referenced, as it contains a forged signature and was never presented to my client before or during the marriage. The claim hung in the air for a moment. James's face remained composed, but I noticed his hand tighten around his pen. That's a serious allegation, Judge Hawkins observed. One we're prepared to substantiate, Vivian replied, removing a folder from her briefcase. We have expert handwriting analysis confirming the forgery, along with proof that Eleanor never saw, discussed, or signed this document. She passed copies to the judge and to Martin, who reviewed them with a carefully neutral expression. These are concerning, Judge Hawkins acknowledged. Mr. Wells, your response? Martin leaned toward James, who whispered something in his ear before addressing the judge directly. Your Honor, my wife may have forgotten signing the agreement, James said, his voice smooth as silk. It was 15 years ago, and the document was among many reviewed during our wedding preparations. As for the handwriting analysis, we'd need our own expert to verify these claims. Of course, Judge Hawkins agreed. That would be appropriate. If this proceeds to court, Ms. Rodriguez, please continue with your client's position. Vivian nodded. The forged prenuptial agreement is just one example of Mr. Harrington's pattern of control and deception throughout the marriage. Mrs. Harrington was not merely a beneficiary of his wealth, she was an active contributor to its creation and growth. She proceeded to outline my contributions. Managing multiple properties valued at over $30 million, organizing social and charity events that facilitated business relationships worth hundreds of millions, and creating the impeccable domestic backdrop against which James had built his professional reputation. Furthermore, Vivian continued, Mrs. Harrington surrendered her own career at Mr. Harrington's insistence, thereby incurring significant opportunity costs. She has been denied access to financial information despite these contributions and has only recently discovered the extent to which marital assets have been concealed. This was the moment we'd prepared for, the careful dance between revealing enough to pressure James without showing our full hand regarding the SEC investigation. We have documented evidence, Vivian said, producing another folder, of offshore accounts, undervalued properties, and investment vehicles deliberately structured to hide marital assets. As Judge Hawkins and the attorneys reviewed these documents, I watched James carefully. The initial shock had passed, replaced by calculation. He was assessing how much we knew, how much we could prove, and how to minimize the damage. In light of these discoveries, Vivian concluded, we are seeking an equitable division of all marital assets, both disclosed and undisclosed, recognition of Mrs. Harrington's non-financial contributions to the marriage, and ongoing support, commensurate with the lifestyle established during the marriage. The room fell silent as Judge Hawkins reviewed the materials before her. Finally, she looked up. Mr. Harrington, these financial disclosures raise significant concerns. Would you care to address them? James exchanged glances with Martin, who gave a barely perceptible nod. Your Honor, James began, his voice carefully modulated to project reasonable concern. These documents represent a fundamental misunderstanding of complex business structures. What appears to be concealment is simply standard practice for protecting legitimate investments from market volatility and competitive intelligence. He was good. I had to give him that. Even now, facing evidence of his deception, he spoke with the unwavering confidence that had built his empire and dominated our marriage. Perhaps we could take a brief recess, Martin suggested. These are complex matters that might benefit from private discussion. Judge Hawkins agreed, and we separated into different conference rooms. As soon as the door closed behind us, Vivian turned to me with a tight smile. "He's rattled," she said. "He didn't expect us to have the offshore documentation." "But he's still not taking me seriously," I observed. "He thinks he can explain this away with corporate doublespeak and technical justifications." "Exactly as we anticipated," Vivian nodded. "Which means it's time for Phase 2. When we reconvened 30 minutes later, the atmosphere had shifted subtly. James and Martin entered with revised documents, a slightly improved offer that still fundamentally undervalued my contributions and protected the bulk of James's assets. "We've reviewed your concerns," Martin began, "and Mr. Harrington is prepared to increase the settlement offer to $5 million, with additional considerations regarding jewelry and artwork. Mrs. Harrington might have personal attachment to—" Judge Hawkins turned to me. "Mrs. Harrington, your thoughts?" For the first time since the mediation began, I spoke directly. $5 million is an insult," I said calmly. "It's less than the value of the art collection I curated for our homes, less than the increase in property values I created through my design work, less than James spends in a year on business entertainment." I leaned forward slightly, meeting James's gaze directly. "But this isn't just about money. It's about recognition. For 15 years, you've treated me as an asset rather than a partner. You've hidden the truth about our finances, forged my signature on legal documents, and constructed a narrative that minimizes everything I've contributed to your success." James's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. "I'm not accepting crumbs from a fortune I helped build," I continued. "And I'm not signing an NDA to protect you from the consequences of your own actions." The challenge hung in the air between us, not just a rejection of his offer, but a direct confrontation of the power dynamic that had defined our marriage. For the first time in 15 years, I was speaking to James as an equal, and for the first time, I could see that he was afraid. The silence that followed my statement stretched longer than was comfortable in such a formal setting. Judge Hawkins glanced between us, sensing the seismic shift in the room. James's attorney shuffled papers unnecessarily, clearly seeking direction from his client. James himself sat perfectly still, his expression a masterclass in controlled fury. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, each word precisely measured. "I see Vivian has coached you well," he said, attempting to redirect the challenge as something manufactured rather than authentic. "But theatrical performances aside, the reality remains unchanged. The financial structures you're questioning are entirely legitimate, and your contributions, while appreciated, hardly entitle you to the compensation you're seeking." He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping further. "Eleanor, be reasonable. You know how this will end if we take it to court. Your public humiliation, your reputation destroyed, and ultimately, a settlement far less generous than what I'm offering today. Is that really what you want?" The threat was explicit, the same intimidation tactic that had worked on me countless times before. But this time I was prepared. "Actually, James," I replied calmly, "I know exactly how this will end if we go to court. The forged prenup alone would devastate your credibility with a judge. The hidden assets would trigger forensic financial investigation you couldn't control. And then there's the matter of the SEC. His composure slipped for just an instant. A barely perceptible widening of the eyes, a momentary stillness in his breathing. Beside him, Martin tensed. "What about the SEC?" Martin asked carefully. I glanced at Vivian, who gave a slight nod of permission. "The Securities and Exchange Commission," I clarified unnecessarily, "which has taken an interest in certain European investment activities. Activities that involve artificially inflated valuations, offshore transfers, and documented forgeries of authorizing signatures." James's face had gone pale, the confident mask completely fallen away. In its place was something I'd rarely seen. Raw, unfiltered fear. This is absurd, he managed, but the force had left his voice. You're making desperate accusations without any foundation. We have the foundation, James, Vivian interjected smoothly. We have the documents, the transaction records, the communication logs. We have contact names, account numbers, and authorization codes. We have everything. Judge Hawkins, observing this exchange with growing concern, cleared her throat. These allegations go beyond the scope of a divorce mediation. If there are issues of potential securities violations— There aren't, James interrupted sharply, then immediately modulated his tone. My apologies, Your Honor. These are baseless claims intended to pressure me into an unreasonable settlement. Perhaps, I said quietly, we should take another recess for private consultation. I'm sure Mr. Harrington would appreciate the opportunity to reconsider his position. The judge agreed, and as we rose to exit, I caught James's eye one final time. The man looking back at me wasn't the powerful, controlling husband who had dominated our marriage. He was someone cornered, calculating desperate odds. It was the look of someone who had just realized he had severely underestimated his opponent. The mediation concluded 2 days later with an agreement that would have been unimaginable when we began. James, facing the dual threats of public exposure and SEC investigation, surrendered much more than he had ever intended. The settlement granted me the Manhattan apartment, half the value of the Hamptons property, a significant portion of our art collection, and most importantly, a 30% stake in Harrington Investments' legitimate holdings. There would be no NDA, no gag order, no restrictions on my future. In exchange, the evidence regarding his financial improprieties would remain with our attorneys, undisclosed unless he violated the settlement terms. It wasn't about greed or revenge. It was about fairness, recognition of my contributions, and the foundation I would need to build my next chapter. Walking out of that final session, I felt lighter than I had in years. Not triumphant exactly, but vindicated. The woman who had been dismissed as a trophy wife had proven herself a formidable adversary. More importantly, she had reclaimed her dignity and her future. The weeks that followed were devoted to reconstruction, both practical and personal. I began with my physical space, reclaiming the Manhattan apartment that had always felt more like a showroom than a home. Room by room, I transformed it, removing the formal, impersonal elements James had insisted upon, and creating spaces that reflected my own aesthetic and needs. The cavernous, formal dining room became a design studio, with drafting tables and material, samples replacing the massive mahogany table where we'd hosted countless strategic dinners. The sterile guest suite transformed into a comfortable room for Olivia, decorated with her input to reflect her emerging identity. The master bedroom, site of so many nights lying awake beside a man who saw me as property, was completely reimagined, from the color of the walls to the artwork to the bed itself. Each change was like exhaling after holding my breath for 15 years. Olivia divided her time between James's new residence and mine, navigating the new reality with surprising resilience. She was closer to me than she had been in years, perhaps sensing the authenticity in this new version of her mother. Dad's different too, she observed one evening as we cooked dinner together. Something that would never have happened in our previous life, where meals were the domain of household staff. Quieter, less, commanding, I guess. People change when their circumstances change, I replied, careful not to disparage James despite everything. He was still her father, and that relationship deserved protection regardless of our divorce. He asked about you, she continued, chopping vegetables with focused precision. About what you're doing, if you're seeing anyone. It was weird. I smiled slightly. I'm sure it was. What did you tell him? That you're busy living your own life, and it's not his business anymore. She glanced up, a hint of uncertainty in her expression. Was that okay? I put down my knife and hugged her. this wonderful, perceptive young woman who had somehow emerged whole despite growing up in the crosscurrents of our dysfunctional marriage. That was perfect, I assured her. Absolutely perfect. The professional reconstruction began more tentatively. 15 years away from formal education or work experience had left gaps that couldn't be instantly filled. But the settlement provided financial security while I explored possibilities, beginning with enrolling in design courses at Parsons to update my skills and credentials. For the first time since before my marriage, I was making choices based solely on what I wanted, what fulfilled me, what aligned with my own values and aspirations. The freedom was occasionally overwhelming, but never unwelcome. 6 months into my new life, I found myself sitting at a small table in a cafe near Central Park, watching people pass by with their daily urgencies and private joys. My design portfolio lay open before me, sketches and material samples for my first real client project, a boutique hotel lobby in Soho that valued my aesthetic enough to take a chance on my newly established design consultancy. The irony wasn't lost on me. After 15 years of creating perfect spaces for James's strategic entertaining, I was finally being paid for the talent he had systematically devalued. A familiar figure approached from across the street. Tall, elegant, purposeful. Diane Lowell, no longer James's chief of operations or his mistress, but rebuilding her own life with similar determination. We had developed an unexpected alliance in the aftermath of the divorce. 2 women reconstructing identities after existing in James Harrington's shadow. "Sorry I'm late," she said, sliding into the chair opposite mine. The interview ran longer than expected. "Good sign," I observed, pouring her a cup of coffee from the small pot on the table. "I think so," she agreed. They seemed impressed by my experience, less concerned about the circumstances of my departure than I expected. We had met this way every few weeks since the settlement. Not as friends exactly, but as fellow travelers on parallel journeys of recovery and redefinition. "Any word from the SEC?" I asked quietly, though the investigation was now common knowledge in financial circles. "The case is proceeding," she replied. "James has hired the best defense team in the country, of course. But from what my contacts tell me, it's not looking good for him. Too much documentation, too many witnesses. They're talking potential plea deals now." I nodded, absorbing this without the satisfaction I might once have expected. James's potential downfall no longer occupied the central place in my thoughts that it once had. My focus had shifted inward, toward building rather than avenging, and "You?" Diane asked. "How are you doing with everything?" I considered the question carefully, looking past the surface-level accomplishments to the deeper transformations of the past months. "I'm learning to trust my voice again," I said finally. "Not just with Olivia or in professional settings, but with myself. I spent so many years filtering my thoughts through James's anticipated reactions that I lost track of what I actually wanted, believed, valued." Diane nodded in understanding. "The internal editor." "Exactly. Dismantling that has been challenging." I traced the rim of my coffee cup, gathering my thoughts. The other day, I was selecting fabrics for the hotel project, and I caught myself thinking, James would say this is too bold. Then I realized, it doesn't matter what James would say. It never should have. "Freedom," Diane observed quietly. "Yes, but it's more complicated than I expected. Freedom isn't just the absence of constraints. It's the presence of choice, of responsibility for those choices. Sometimes that's overwhelming." "Worth it, though?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Absolutely." I closed my portfolio, my decisions already made without James's, ghost hovering over my shoulder. "I keep thinking about something my daughter said recently. She told me she's proud of me, not for winning the settlement or securing our financial future, but for becoming real." "Becoming real," Diane repeated thoughtfully. "That's it exactly." We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, two women who had emerged from the same man's shadow to stand in our own light, not unscathed, not unmarked by the experience, but fundamentally, irrevocably changed. "You know," I said finally, "I never thought I'd say this, but in a strange way, I'm grateful." To James, Diane raised an eyebrow in surprise. "Not for the control or the erasure," I clarified, "but for the awakening that followed. I don't think I would have discovered my own strength if it hadn't been tested so thoroughly. I wouldn't have learned to value my voice if I hadn't lost it for so long." 1 year to the day after James had called me a trophy wife in that courtroom, I stood at the entrance of a gallery in Chelsea, watching as people moved through the space I had designed. The conversion of the former industrial building into an airy, light-filled showcase for emerging artists had been my biggest project to date. A collaboration with an investor who valued both my design aesthetic and my understanding of how space influences experience. "Quite a turnout," observed a voice beside me. I turned to find Dr. Sarah Chen, the therapist who had helped me find my way back to myself during those critical months of transition. "I didn't know you were coming," I said, genuinely pleased to see her outside the context of her office. "I wouldn't have missed it," she replied. "This space is a physical manifestation of everything we worked toward, your vision, uncompromised." I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The gallery represented more than a professional achievement. It was tangible proof of my transformation. Every decision, from the exposed brick walls I'd insisted on preserving to the innovative lighting system I'd designed specifically for this space, reflected choices I had made without second-guessing, without an internal voice questioning if they were acceptable to someone else. "Mom!" Olivia appeared from the crowd, her boyfriend, Mark, trailing slightly behind her. At 17, she carried herself with a confidence I hadn't developed until much later in life. "This place is incredible. Professor Winters from the Parsons Admission Committee is here, and he's totally impressed. I told him you're my mother, and he wants to meet you." I smiled at her enthusiasm. Olivia had recently decided to pursue architecture, inspired partly by watching my journey back to design. The thought of her following a similar creative path while avoiding my detours filled me with quiet pride. As we moved through the crowded gallery, I found myself remembering that day in court. The humiliation, the shock, the moment when James had tried to reduce 15 years of my life to a decorative role in his. If someone had told me then that his cruel dismissal would ultimately set me free, I wouldn't have believed them. But sometimes the worst moments contain the seeds of our greatest transformations. Later that evening, as the event wound down and only a few guests remained, I stepped outside for a moment of quiet reflection. The spring air was cool against my skin, the street alive with the energy that makes New York pulse even at night. "Eleanor." I turned at the sound of my name, spoken in a voice I would recognize anywhere. James stood a few feet away, impeccably dressed as always, but somehow diminished from the commanding presence I remembered. The SEC investigation had taken its toll, both financially and personally. He had avoided prison through a combination of legal maneuvering and substantial fines, but his reputation in financial circles was irreparably damaged. "I saw the write-up about the gallery opening in the Times," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "Congratulations." "Thank you," I replied, surprised by the genuine equanimity I felt in his presence. Neither anger nor fear, just a calm acknowledgement of our shared past and separate futures. "Olivia mentioned you're taking on more projects," he continued. "She's very proud of you." "She's told me the same about you," I offered. "That you're rebuilding, focusing on smaller ventures." He nodded, a flicker of something like humility crossing his features. "Starting over has been educational." We stood in silence for a moment, the gap between us filled with 15 years of history, some of it painful, some of it valuable, all of it now complete. "I should go," he said finally. I just wanted to say, you've proven me wrong. About many things. As he turned to leave, I found myself saying, James. He paused, looking back. I hope you find what you're looking for. It wasn't forgiveness exactly. Some wounds run too deep for simple healing. But it was liberation. From bitterness, from the need for vindication, from the last emotional ties that had bound me to the past. Watching him walk away, I felt the final piece of my transformation lock into place. I was no longer defined in relation to James Harrington, neither as his wife nor as his adversary. I was simply, completely Eleanor. Turned back toward the gallery, my creation, my future, and stepped forward into the life I had built for myself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.